Okay, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us in this presentation, the first of a series of presentations under the overarching title of Waste Trade and its Prevention. Uh, Today we're going to be at part one, and that is why waste moves and the advent of the Basel Convention. Um, I'm Jim Puckett. I'm your guide on this journey. The presentation with questions can go as long as 1 hour and a half. So hang in there, and there will be time for questions at the end as long as we want to go with those. And Angelo on our team will be helping you through those either by raised hand or by questions in the chat room. This presentation will be recorded, as will all of these in this series. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be listing a few of the others that are coming in the series that you can look forward to. So as I said, I'm Jim Puckett. I've been working on waste trade and its prevention for most of my waking life. And I'm really pleased to be presenting to you today why waste moves, which is a fundamental question if you're going to be talking about waste trade, the history of the Basel Convention, which is the answer to the movement of waste, or one answer to it, and the basics of that convention, what it does. So that's what we're going to cover in part one. So first of all, why waste moves? It's really the history of pollution, which this is a form of, is one of cost externalization. And if you're not familiar with that term, we'll be discussing it here, but it's so important to everything having to do with our problems on Earth, on planet Earth today. Pollution would not even exist if it weren't for this phenomenon of cost externalization, except for accidental pollution. It really is the fundament of so many of the evils of the world that it's worth talking about it. Whether it's air pollution, water pollution, or waste trade, it's all about cost externalization. And what is that? It's a market distortion. It's an economic term that occurs when an action taken damages others or nature, and that results in a cost that is not paid by that actor, either to prevent it in the first place or to compensate for the damage done. And throughout history, this is extremely common. Almost everything we purchase today has cost externalities associated with it. Throughout history, those that extract resources, use resources, and harness technology seldom have had to pay or charge the entirety of the true costs that would account for the damage done. So in fact, the true cost of something that you buy in the market is far greater than the market price. So there's hidden costs that are not paid for, and those are externalities. So I'll take an example. We have a very popular market here in North America called Trader Joe's. It likes to bring commodities in from all over the world and sell them cheap. And here's a package of cooked shrimp that I found, and it's going for $8.97. And it's amazing, a good price for that juicy 70 to 100 tin shrimp in there. But what do the costs of getting that shrimp in that bag entail? It's all about aquaculture with shrimp these days, and they go in and they strip out the mangrove forests and they put in these aquaculture farms, and the loss of mangroves is very impactful. They are the natural fisheries of our world, the habitat for fish, and that means basically the food chain of the entire marine environment is being damaged. Who pays for that? And then when you make shrimp through aquaculture, you're going to be using pesticides. A lot of people don't realize that, but the shrimp you're getting are heavily contaminated with pesticides most often. That has an impact. Then you can look at the labor conditions of the people working in that industry. the lack of sanitation, the lack of health care, the lack of workers' rights and their benefits. These all have a negative impact as well that has a real economic cost. And then when you ship this stuff clear across the world to have it be consumed, you're burning bunker fuel. And those costs are borne on the global commons, our atmosphere, and that has a tremendous economic cost also. So how much was that $8.97 bag of shrimp really worth? Why did we pay so little? Who is paying for the difference? And when you talk about paying externalized costs, you're usually talking about paying for it with your health or degradation to your environment. And in cost externalization, waste management is what we're really focusing in on today with waste trade. And there's a little mini history of that here, where after the industrialized age happened, we had little factories springing up. And the first thing the factories would do with their waste was to put it out in the backyard and often burn it out in the field. People living near the factory didn't like that. They said, no, that's horrible. You got to stop that. So the factory built a smokestack and put that stack up there and let the smoke go downwind. Well, the people downwind didn't like it either, and they complained. And so the factory said, well, we can just turn it into liquid waste and solid waste. And I got a great idea. We'll build a pipeline and put it into the river. And the fishermen didn't like it going into the river. The people that swam in the river didn't like that. So there were more complaints and more rules and more laws to prevent it. So someone had the brilliant idea, let's just take it out to the open ocean and dump it. And this has been the game, finding the path of least resistance, finding ways to have others or the earth pay for the damage. So the response to this, of course, is regulation. That was the first thing people came up with. We will internalize these costs, make people pay, and do it the right way through regulation. And indeed, we had public nuisance laws that banned the open burning of waste in the backyards of factories. We had Clean Air Acts around the world to stop the smokes coming out of the stacks, require pollution prevention controls. We had the Clean Water Act, which made it very difficult and much more costly to throw things into rivers. And indeed, we had the London Convention in the early 1990s that banned the dumping at sea and the incineration of waste at sea. So where is the path of least resistance? This cost internalization in developed countries through regulation led to one last outlet, externalization to developing countries lacking regulation through the waste trade. So instead of dumping those container loads and barrels into the sea, they took them to the global south and dumped them there. So it brings me to this guy. This guy is famous economist who's worked for many of our presidents. He was our Secretary of Treasury for a while. Back in 1991, he wrote a memo which became infamous and went around the world because it had some amazing statements in it. One of them was, I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. Impeccable means it's absolutely brilliant. It's without fault. And he also said in this memo, I've always thought that underpopulated countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Well, Lawrence Summers then disavowed this. He said it was a joke, and then he said he never wrote it. It was one of his aides that wrote it. But that wasn't as important as the fact that what he was writing was really impeccable logic from the standpoint of traditional economics, which embraces externalities. You're going to allow externalities, and it's okay to have things not be accounted for, not have true cost economics, then indeed the logic is impeccable. And that logic graphically looks like this. We have internalized costs on the left, making things more expensive in the rich countries to manage, so it will toboggan downhill to the poorer countries on the pathway of least resistance to find the cheapest way to get rid of stuff and burden others with it. And we have three major waste streams today that are moving down that pathway of impeccable logic. One of them is our old ships, and these are being dumped in South Asia, in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Horrific conditions for the workers taking these ships apart basically with their bare hands. We have the e-waste trade, all our electronics, primarily going to Asia and to a lesser degree to Africa at the moment. Still a tremendous problem. And most recently, we've become aware of a new scourge in the waste trade, which is plastic waste trade. Most of that currently is going to Southeast Asia now that China has said we've had enough. So remember that bag with respect to that example. Let's look at the example of plastic waste. What are those hidden costs we're talking about? It's so important to know what these are. Examples of externalities with the plastic waste trade. Who pays for the real cost of the greenhouse gases emitted as that ship burns bunker fuel across the ocean just to get rid of that waste? Who pays for impaired human health of the workers in the recycling plant, breathing in the volatile organic compounds when they melt down the plastic they are recycling? Who pays for the loss of potable drinking water when the groundwater and surface water is contaminated? Who pays for the cancer-causing exposure from the burning of unrecyclable plastic waste? And who pays for a farmer's loss of livelihood when it discovered that his crops and animals' milk and eggs are contaminated with toxins like dioxin? Who pays indeed? Waste most often follows a pathway of greatest opportunity for cost externalization. This is why waste moves. These opportunities are functions of disparities in political or economic power. Again, the path of least resistance. Such waste trade is exploitation. Now, I might make a footnote here. Not all waste trade is going to be externalization, but I would say about 90% of it is. There are instances like in the European Union where waste moves to another facility which is equivalent and is not looking to externalize costs. There's waste trade that moves to internalize costs, but again, it's the vast minority, I'm afraid. So the phenomenon we're experiencing as waste trade is exploitation for the most part. Now, when you look at our products, it's not just about the end of the life cycle. If we really look at all the externalities in a total life cycle situation, we realize something. We realize that in the global south, they are doing the extraction, digging the holes, making the mines, taking the trees away for the most part. They are also the places where the dirty factories, for the most part, are located. And so they ship the product to the global north. We experience it as a product. And then when we're not happy with it anymore, we send it back to the global south as waste. It's not a pretty picture. They're losing their health and their environment. We've lost our jobs. And it's not obviously any kind of ideal. If you look at one particular industry, for example, electronics, starting at the bottom of this diagram, you'll see that first we have to extract the metals out of the ground. That's mining. That skull and crossbones there is the relative amount of externalities that you would experience from that type of operation. And then we have production, also tremendous externalities in terms of pollution, mostly in-house, that affects the workers in plants like Samsung and Sony and all of the companies are building. Tremendous problems with occupational safety and health. And then when we use it, there's small amounts of externalities and toxicity with off-gassing from the plastics, for example, very small. And then it gets disassembled. Again, very small amount of hazard from disassembly, but then it moves to disposal and recycling where the externalities are intense. A lot of times it gets burned, flushed into the groundwater, etc. And if we look at this, we're seeing that this orange area I've shaded here is what happens in the global south today. We experience the lesser externalities in the global north. So we can say that in a globalized world, poorer countries and communities are disproportionately burdened from toxic use, toxic production, and toxic waste. The life cycle of most products we consume tells a story of environmental injustice. Our job is to reverse this by ensuring all costs make sense, and if they do make sense, they are internalized. So that's certainly our job. I thank everyone on this call, and certainly the mission of BAN. There are three big drivers. We're looking at big issues when we talk about externalities. You're not going to just be able to nibble away at this monster. It's going to take a while because the big drivers are pretty tough. We're looking at the global commons syndrome, where by virtue of weak global governance, we don't have a lot of treaties that have a lot of teeth. We're starting to get them going. Montreal Protocol, Basel Convention, Paris Accords. But it's really easy to contaminate the atmosphere and the oceans without anybody arresting you and pulling you into court. It's the global commons. Who owns it? And then the other big issue is a lack of democracy and empowerment in much of the world that can give people the right to redress damage done to them. So if you're being exploited, if you have externalities being foisted on you, you need to have the right to speak up. Your complaint has to mean something. And then finally, the biggest driver of all is global inequity. It creates desperation for any kind of job, for example. It creates labor cost disparity, which is associated with a lack of safety nets and precautions and protections in weaker economies. Those are the three biggies we're up against. Well, the Basel Convention was a means to try to address those. It's one of those regulatory examples I gave, like the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, to try to internalize some of those blatant externalities that are taking place by virtue of intermodal traffic on ships. And I'll give a little story here of its history because it is very interesting. It all arose from the 1980s, late 1980s, when a lot of those cheap and dirty dumping options were being banned, especially for solid factory waste, hazardous waste that often was associated with barrels. And they would realize that, man, it's getting real expensive in the countries in Europe and North America to just put that in a landfill. You're going to have to pay a lot for it. So why not just load it up on a ship and send it abroad? And there was some really poignant, horrible examples of this. In 1986, the Cayenne Sea left Philadelphia with incinerator ashes, and it was looking for a place to dump them anywhere in the world, and they thought they'll be able to find a country to do that. It dumped half its load in Haiti, and this ship was called the Cayenne Sea, and this is where it was dumped. And then they were thrown out of Haiti before they got their load fully dumped, and that ship traveled around the world looking for places to send the rest of it. We had another case where Italian waste from the Italian chemical industry went to Nigeria and was just stacked up on a beach. People ended up dying from this, as did many of the cattle from the farmers that lived there. It became a huge scandal, and this also precipitated what came next, which was the Basel Convention. And finally, we had this voyage, infamous at the time, of the Islip, New York garbage barge, where they also said, we don't know what we're going to do with this. We don't have a landfill in North America that's going to take it. Let's just put it on a barge and send it down to the Caribbean. See if we can find an island that'll take it for money. And this proved to be quite a scandal. Burn it, bury it, recycle it, or send it on a Caribbean cruise. So those incidents really became epidemic. Those are just some of them, very high profile. And at that time, Greenpeace started chronicling all of these and targeting the incidents of this type of trade intensively, fanning the information flow about what was going on. And they created an inventory of this that's like a phone book, because they were finding so many incidences of this waste trade that it could fill up this phone book about countries all over the world that were being offered money to take waste. And that led us to the United Nations Environment Program deciding this is a good idea for a treaty. And Mustafa Tolba, who was the head of the program at the time, called for a new convention to protect Africa and the world. He said this is indeed a very good example of why we have international accords. because it's transboundary in nature, and certain parts of the world are being impacted by other parts of the world. So this is the call for the Basel Convention made in 1988. The reason it's called the Basel Convention is kind of interesting because it comes from a tragedy of this chemical fires that took place in Basel, Switzerland in 1986 that totally destroyed the Rhine River in terms of all the life in it. All the salmon died. All these chemicals were flushed down from the fires in Basel, Switzerland, all the way down the Rhine to the Netherlands, and killed the entire river. And they had a PR problem. They had a public relations nightmare. And they said, we want to do something about it. We want the convention to be called the Basel Convention. We're going to fund its development and fund the housing of its secretariat as the chemical industry. So that's why it's based in Basel. Well, the convention convened after several negotiation sessions in 1989 in Basel, and it was adopted. And what was adopted? Well, this is the banner that was hung outside the adoption. Most of the countries that went to Basel, Switzerland wanted a treaty that had a ban in it, that had a full ban on the dumping on developing countries from developed countries. And by the nature of international law, which is decided by the lowest common denominator in the room, which in this case was the United States, we never achieved a ban to developing countries in the first original text of the convention. And this is why this banner was hung and says what it did, what it does say. And the African group quite pointedly walked out of the meeting and said, we're not going to sign it. We are not going to do anything with this until we go back to Africa and make our own treaty, our own convention to protect Africa. They were pretty disgusted. So the next step was that indeed, to their credit, the developing countries did go back home and made regional agreements to protect their regions. These are some of the original treaties that were established. The first one was the Central American Agreement, which was very easy to do. It only involved 5 countries in Central America that had their presidents just sign it. It wasn't really legislated. It was just an edict from the presidents that we will not import any kind of hazardous waste into our countries. The Bamako Convention was negotiated and is a full-blown convention, adopted in 1991, went into force in 1998, still very powerful. Waigani Treaty for the South Pacific countries also. And in the Mediterranean region, the Izmir Protocol, a little later to actually go into force, but it was created in 1996 and is now in force for the parties of the Barcelona Convention, protecting the Mediterranean Sea. So regional agreements were very powerful to instill a ban. The original concept that everyone wanted was a ban on this type of dumping. And those regional treaties all were bans. So when it came time for the second meeting of the Conference of Parties in 1994, indeed, the developing countries got all their regional agreements together and they said, okay, we're already bound regionally by this concept. We are going to join forces and ban it globally. And this is a copy of the original proposal by the Group of 77 developing countries and China to proceed with a full ban at the global level. And the thing that really made it happen, of course, they pushed hard. And then the EU saw that the developing countries really were going this way. And they made a decision finally to jump on board the ban, led by Denmark. And it was at that point when the EU jumped on board that it isolated all the other developed countries, and the combination of the developing countries and the EU made it happen. So they adopted the ban as a decision. And so the detractors of it, the few countries like the US, Canada, Japan, said, no, this is nothing. It's nothing. It's just a decision. It's not legally binding. So until it's legally binding and part of the convention as an amendment, it's really nothing. So indeed, at the next year's meeting, at COP number 3, a decision to amend the convention was put on the table, and it passed again by consensus. So the next thing that happened in the history of the evolution of the convention was that shipbreaking was brought to the fore of the convention by Greenpeace and BAN, and it became a very prominent issue for a time while the ban was, sitting there collecting ratifications. Next thing that happened was they adopted a protocol on liability and compensation. And this is really, unfortunately, really a nothing burger. It's just a footnote in the history right now. It's not in force. Nobody seems to like this protocol. For those that would be protected, it's not enough. For those that would be paying the bills for the protection, it's too much. Nobody wants to ratify it. So it's currently not in force. I think it has 12 ratifications and it needs 20 to go into force. Completely stalled. The next thing that I could say really is a serious note in the history and the timeline are the many, many efforts by the Just Cans countries. Now, what is Just Cans? That's an acronym for all of the developed countries minus Europe, basically. So it's Japan, United States, Canada, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. Those countries have been a block, and it's not a joke. They actually meet together. They call themselves the Just Cans, and they're the countries that have tried many, many ways to undo, to weaken, delay the entry into force of the Ban Amendment. And it's been most of my life, I've been fending off these rearguard attempts to scuttle the ban. And these are some of the ways they've done it. In 1994, they said again that it's not legally binding, so we had to go with an amendment. They said that Article 11, which is a part of the convention, allows you to create new agreements that could be used to circumvent the ban. And the EU, thankfully at that time, lodged a legal opinion, was very persuasive that that was not possible. And then countries said, well, this Annex 7 group, which the ban applies to, we can just have any countries jump on board that Annex 7 and water the whole thing down. And then that way it'll be like an opt-in, opt-out ban. Unfortunately, at COP4, that was proposed, but it was agreed in a compromise not to change the list of countries the ban applied to until it entered into force. And then many countries were lobbied not to ratify the ban. And this slowed things down tremendously. A lot of backroom deals with aid projects. If you ratify the ban, you will not get X, Y, and Z. Really problematic, so that most developing countries were very leery of ratifying it. And then the final straw that was looking like it would break the ban's back was that they found an ambiguity in Article 17, which describes how conventions can be amended. And it was true. It wasn't clear in the text whether it meant 3/4 of the parties at the time it was adopted or 3/4 of the parties at any given moment in time, i.e. now. That made a huge difference. And it created a huge impasse and logjam because the treaty text was ambiguous. And so what the result of that is that Switzerland and Indonesia stepped up and held a country-led initiative of negotiations. And the result of that was they agreed to have the earliest entry into force of the ban, but many projects were given to provide greater clarity, to decide what environmentally sound management was, dangerous projects of the convention which could water things down if we weren't careful. So those are some of the efforts of the Just Cans to undo, weaken, delay its entry into force. So when people wonder why it took so long for the ban to finally come into force, I gave away the story that it did. This is why. Basel Action Network brings the issue of e-waste to the convention. In 2002, we published Exporting Harm, the High-Tech Trashing of Asia, and that set so much on course. The world suddenly was awake and seeing what was happening with all the electronic waste, what a tremendous global problem it was, and what a waste trade problem it was. So we can take credit for that, and that's still going on today, so we can't take credit for that. But the issue is on the table, and certainly one that we all should be continuing to work on. And then this CLI initiative, which I mentioned, did culminate in 2011 to have the ban enter into force in the fastest track. And what that meant at that time was that it needed only 15 more ratifications for it to enter into force. So from 2011 till 2019, we needed only 15. It took that long. The next thing that happened of note was that Norway, just very recently, 2018, brought the issue of plastic waste to the convention. And why did they do it? The whole world was freaking out about plastic in the marine environment, and rightly so. The contamination levels of microplastics, packaging plastics, single-use plastics all over the globe was frightening everybody once they started looking at the data. And the other issue is that China had said, we're not going to take your plastic waste anymore to all the rich countries of the world. And it started going to places like this picture in Indonesia, where it was theoretically recycled, but no, most of it was dumped and burned, and it's still happening today. So Norway said, we got to do something about this. And they indeed proposed to add mixed and dirty plastic waste to controlled waste under Annex 2 and subject to the Basel controls. They did that in 2019. And the NGO community, many of you part of it, were there at that meeting supporting the Norwegian amendments, and it passed by consensus with only the United States and countries speaking for them, Argentina and Brazil, opposing. But they didn't oppose to block it. So it passed by consensus. And then the Basel Ban Amendment entered into force in that same year at the end on December 5th, 2019. And I'm happy to say that if you go onto the convention website now and look at the text of the convention, there it is, Article 4A. It is now in the convention. It's part of the convention. And you might ask, why did it, that take so long and the plastic amendments not take so long? A lot easier to amend an annex, which is what the Norwegians proposed, rather than amend the actual text of the convention. Something to remember. And there you'll see that we have 100 parties now that have ratified the ban amendment. Just as of this month, Nicaragua made it 100. If you want to know more about the ban amendment, there will be a webinar about it, but we've already produced a guide in depth about the ban amendment and its entry into force and its significance. You can get that on our website. So finally, the biggest milestone beyond that is that these plastic amendments that Norway proposed entered into force this year on January 1. We've already done some webinars on that subject. You can find those on our website as well. So what that means is that mixed and dirty plastics are going to be controlled, but it means more than that for certain parts of the world. It means that the exports from the US to Basel parties are now illegal. It means that exports from the European Union to developing countries are illegal. And it means that for everyone else, all the other combinations of countries, it's basically control procedure of notification and consent before you can export. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the basics of the convention. So what does this convention do? I'm not going to go through it article by article. I'm just going to give you the quick and not so dirty aspects of how it works and what it does for us, how it can succeed in internalizing costs. Convention takes place in Geneva. All the countries of the world are trying to convene there, all except 8, which I'll talk about. This is the text on the right, which you can download from their website. And it is a very significant treaty, the most significant treaty you probably never heard of. It's the world's only treaty on waste. It was adopted in 1989 in Basel, entered into force in 1992, currently has 188 members, parties, as they're called. And we've been to every meeting since 1997. And before that, when I worked with Greenpeace, I've been to every meeting since its adoption. Now, I mentioned that there's 188 parties. One of those parties is the European Union. But if we just look at the countries, there's 187 countries. And because it was so much easier to show the non-parties than to show all the parties, that's what I've done. And some of them are so tiny you don't see them. but there's one obvious one that really sticks out, and that's the United States. So we have East Timor, Grenada, Fiji, Haiti, San Marino, the Solomon Islands, South Sudan, and the US are the only UN countries that have failed to ratify this treaty. So it has great global saturation. And what does it do? It's got soft law, which is called soft law because it's important as general obligations, but people are not going to go to jail usually for these types of things if they violate them. They're principles. It calls for self-sufficiency at a national level in waste management. Calls for minimizing all forms of transboundary movement of hazardous and other wastes. Calls for minimizing the generation of hazardous and other wastes. Very important. It's the only place in international law you'll see language about eliminating waste generation at source as a solution. Calls for ensuring that environmentally sound management is accomplished for all that which is produced, all the waste that still is produced. If you couldn't eliminate through minimization, then it has to be environmentally sound management. And the hard law aspects, this is where you can get yourself in trouble, get yourself thrown in jail if you don't follow this. And it starts with the definitions. So the definitions of what is in the scope of the convention, what is covered. There's two different annexes. One is hazardous waste, and then there's another annex of other waste. Hazardous waste is according to annexes 1, 3, and 8. And there's also, as hazardous waste, are anything that any country declares is a hazardous waste. So countries have the sovereign right to say, I want to call this a hazardous waste, and then all the other Basel parties have to respect that. And then the other waste category is waste for special consideration, and that's known as Annex 2. In that, we have waste collected from households, we have incinerator ashes from incinerating household waste, and we have these new plastic wastes, which are dirty and contaminated, that we've just added to the list, and that goes into force this month. So those defined annexes are controlled wastes. And what are those controls? They're either going to be the default control of prior informed consent, which means before you export something, you have to notify that it's going to the country, and you can't export it until you get their consent to receive it. Country to country, not company to company. It's state to state. It also defines illegal traffic. So anything that's not conforming to the PIC procedure, as it's called, prior informed consent, is going to be a criminal act. And then the other type of control, which is becoming increasingly important, are the prohibitions, the bans, out and out bans. Parties may ban imports nationally. The original treaty had one ban in it, which is you can't send things past 60 degrees south latitude, Antarctica. There's a ban that's also very important on trade between the parties of the convention and non-parties. And the reason that's really important is because the US is a non-party. So normally you can't trade waste from the US to Basel parties unless you have a special Article 11 agreement. And then we have the latest ban, which I've talked about, the Basel Ban Amendment, which applies only to hazardous waste. And it's for those wastes going basically from OECD to non-OECD countries, from developed to developing countries. And that's now forbidden, but only for hazardous waste, not for Annex 2. So then we have compliance and enforcement, the final part of the hard law, which is worth looking at. A lot of people will ask, how is this enforced? How does it work? So basically in the convention, it says if the controls of the PIC procedure or the bans are not followed, it's a criminal act, and you have to treat it criminally at your national level. And if the export was illegal, there's a provision for the exporting country to take it back after 30 days. This is going to be increasingly important. And it's really important to know that in international law, the enforcement takes place at the national level. So that begs the question, what do you do if a country doesn't want to enforce their international law? And in that case, you're left with three possibilities. You can shame them via the media in front of them at the conference of parties, and Ban has done that quite a lot. And I would have to say it's very useful and very effective. You make a case in front of everybody that they are violating their obligations, and it can be quite powerful. We finally got Canada to take back waste from the Philippines by shaming them to death. Sometimes citizens have to have standing to sue their governments. Depending on the country, you can actually sometimes sue your government for not following international law. And then there's the third avenue, which is the Implementation and Compliance Committee. It's very weak. You're basically limited to countries saying, I screwed up and I admit that I violated the law, or you have a victim country saying, I've been victimized. And it's unfortunately a very weak mechanism and has had very little effect. So Basel Convention in the beginning was designed to manage factory waste, coming out of industry. It's very interesting. Today, most of the waste we're dealing with is post-consumer waste. I mentioned to you already that it's old ships, which is a form of post-consumer waste, our junk that we use, and then it goes old at its end of life. And that's the type of waste we're dealing with these days. Electronic waste is another classic example. And finally, plastic waste trade. I want to make a little detour here to put a plug in. We at BAN are going to be housing a center, a hub for plastic waste trade information, global map of all the incidents, all the trade flow data, etc. So stay tuned for that. It'll be coming very soon in the next month or two. Some interesting facts, some fun facts about the Basel Convention. There's never been a vote taken at the Basel Convention, but it's very powerful to have that possibility. All decisions have so far been adopted by consensus, but there's been many times when BAN and other parties have threatened a vote, and that has a great amount of power. Nobody wants to be called out voting, and the votes are very public of who's saying what. And that's kind of a last recourse. It's very important not to have everything done by the lowest common denominator. Sometimes majority needs to rule. The US is the only developed country that is not ratified. Today, there are only 2 countries that have signed the convention, which means you intend to ratify it. That's what happens when it's adopted, and yet never ratified. And those countries are Haiti and the US. Because the US has waited so long to ratify it, when they do, they will have to accept the Basel ban, which they have long opposed, because now, as I mentioned, the ban is part of the treaty that they would ratify. So what makes Basel special? I'm frustrated with it all the time, but when I step back and think about what it's been able to do and what kind of marker it puts down to the world, it is special. It's the world's only treaty created primarily by and for developing countries that I'm aware of. It's the world's only treaty on waste, as I mentioned. It's the world's only treaty focused on environmental justice and cost externalization. You won't see those terms anywhere in the treaty, but they're absolutely what it's all about. It's a rare example of global promotion of trade barriers to better the environment, that it's not completely taboo to put up a trade barrier in the climate of free trade being uber alles. And it's a rare example of a treaty designed to legislate cost internalization. One of the highest saturation rates of any treaty. There's only 8 UN countries that are not a party to it. So that right there is very powerful. Unfortunately, the world's most wasteful country per capita, the United States, is not part of it, and that's a big problem. So for more resources, to learn more, the Basel Convention website is obviously very important. That's where you can get the text of the treaty. The UN Treaty Depository is a very interesting website where you can see in real time the parties. So as soon as a deposit is made in the depository of a ratification, it's right there. That is the definitive source. The Basel Action Network website, we have many webinars, many documents there. It's a great resource as well. And if you want a copy of the plastic amendments, the actual amendments, they're very wordy, but that's at this site. It's also housed on our website. And we also have a country status chart with respect to the bans on waste trade. And it's available there as well. So at this point, and you've made it this far, I thank you very much. And for getting through the first part of our long series on waste trade and its prevention. And certainly, if you want to ask a question that maybe I didn't cover, I'll try my best to go into it, because I know a lot of people can't wait to have all the parts of the series before they ask their questions. So go for it. And I'll let Angelo now handle the questions. But before we do that, these are some of the topics that are coming up: electronic waste trade, plastic waste trade, the shame of shipping, waste trade in the circular economy, the Basel Ban Amendment, using the law to stop waste trade, using tracking to stop waste trade, and the plastic trade amendments. So, and we'll have one on plastic waste trade as well. So in this way, we can really get into issues and not just skim the surface. Thank you very much. And I'll let Angelo field questions either by raising your hand or putting on into the chat room.
Yeah, so if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I see we have a raised hand here, so I will unmute you. And you will need to unmute yourself there, Donovan.
Thank you, one and all. McLaren from Kingston, Jamaica. A question here. Hi. How does the ISO 323 regulations, these are voluntary standards, how does this dovetail into the Basel Convention as it relates to e-waste? Is there some alignment, or can there be an alignment? Thanks.
Which ISO standard are you referring to?
323, the circular economy, which deal with waste and electronic waste more precisely.
Yeah, so the ISO standards are voluntary. There is very weak certification that takes place. They are a good step, but they can be manipulated, and far too often ISO standards are accused of being a greenwash technique. So people can say, I've got a nice standard, I put it on my website, so I'm a good guy. Very easy to do that. In fact, a lot of these are self-certifying. So it gets people thinking in the right direction, but the real danger of these ISO standards, they look like they have teeth. They look like the world is changing, when in fact, all too often they're made to be a greenwash and to just bathe yourselves in glory when you really make very little effort. Now, we know a lot about certifications because we run one on electronic waste recycling, and it has teeth. It is very strict. We do unannounced inspections. We have actual performance requirements that you have to meet. We also check all our recyclers with GPS trackers to make sure everything's going where they say it's going. So it's really important that you have a way to verify and enforce any standard, and ISO standards usually do not have that.
Thank you for that question, Donovan. We have a few comments here from Samantha and Michael. They say, thank you for the presentation. We have a question here from Shikar. They ask, why has India not ratified the Basel Ban?
Well, we need to ask the government, but you know, I've been in this game so long that I remember India was one of the big promoters of the Ban Amendment. And when they got the, you know, a different government that was very much a different mindset from an economic standpoint, they became free traders, and it changed. That was a long time ago. They don't see themselves as a developing country. They see themselves as a country that wants to be dominant, and they unfortunately have lost that initiative at the moment. They would like to see themselves as one of the OECD, and yet India is getting victimized still. They've had to recently ban the import of plastic waste, and that was important that they did that. But yeah, I think it's a lot of this comes down to politics, and a lot of it comes down to politicians. So very important who you elect as president, as head of state. That is very influential in terms of international law. So having said that, people probably are going to ask, do you think the US is ever going to ratify? And I am not one to want to hold my breath, but every time you get a new president and a new administration, things can change dramatically, as we've seen, unfortunately, in the negative way. So it's always makes me have some hope, but I'm certainly not going to hold my breath, because in the Obama administration, Clinton administration, Carter administration, both of the Bushes, they had it on the table to look at, and they refused to do it. So it's a concern.
We have Pamela here asking the question, can you make suggestions about how to find out the path of the recycling for one's own city? So
yeah.
finding out the path of the recycling for one's own city.
Yeah, this is something we are very concerned with, and we have whole projects called the Waste Transparency Projects. And we believe that people have the right to know where their waste goes. And beyond the banning of it, before you do that, perhaps we need to have the right to know where it's going, particularly in a country like the US that is not even a party. We are promoting now and are going to try to ramp up a campaign to push model legislation in cities and in states in lieu of a Basel Convention ratification, and in lieu of handling their plastics in accordance with the convention or their e-waste, that the waste haulers, which are funded by the taxpayers and the ratepayers, they have to divulge. And right now, amazingly enough, they don't have to. A city like mine, Seattle, they don't know where the waste goes. If they ask the company might tell them anything, but they have no proof. They don't even have a requirement that it get divulged. So this is extremely important, because once you know where it's going, then you can go there and say, yes, but this is not environmentally sound recycling. They're dumping 30% of what they're importing, and it gets burned. This is not environmentally sound. And yet this is what's been going on for years. And it's high time that we have these transparency initiatives. One of the things we're going to talk about in this series is how to track waste. So as citizens, in lieu of these legal requirements, we can do that. We can put GPS trackers into electronics. We did that. We're now gearing up to use GPS trackers in plastic waste, and we will do that. And that's a real game changer, because there you can follow the waste in real time. You don't have to rely on somebody filling out a form and bills of lading and saying, this is a certain type of waste going to this place. We can actually really follow it from the exporter through the ports to the doorstep of the company. And then we can go to that company and say, but you said you're recycling, when in fact, so much of it is not being recycled, and that which is highly polluting. And this is the problem. We have been facing a myth of recycling as it always being benign, but unfortunately, as it is practiced in the global south, it's all about externalities, and it's highly polluting and damaging to the workers as well.
We have, sorry, we have a handful of questions here, so I'll be getting through them. The next question is, can a country ask for damages for waste dumping? And from whom? Would it be from the Basel country or the company involved?
The whole idea of getting damages from one country to another is why they proposed having a liability and compensation regime in the Basel Convention. But when they sat down and negotiated it, it was terribly weak, because the rich countries didn't want to have any liability whatsoever. So again, it's a treaty, it's a protocol that nobody can accept. And so there really is not a good mechanism to get that damage except through normal tort law, where you take people to court and you sue them for damages, and you see what you can do depending on the jurisdictions involved. Other than that, the Basel Convention parties do have this obligation to repatriate waste, which they have been perpetrating illegally. So if they're the ones that it was an illegal export and it's their fault for allowing it, then they need to take responsibility for repatriating it or find another solution for it. So that can be a powerful mechanism as well. At the end of the day, after about 10 years of hammering on Canada to take back massive volumes, massive numbers of containers of solid garbage waste to the Philippines, they finally took it back at their cost. And they obviously didn't take it all back. Some of it was already landfilled, but they did have to pay in a tremendous amount. And they also suffered the public relations nightmare of what they did. So I think a lesson was learned there by Canada, and other countries hopefully will see that it's better to immediately, compensate and take action to take the waste back.
Great. We have a question here from Shuan. I will be unmuting you, so unmute yourself and you can talk.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Thank you for informative presentation. And please share with us via email. And my question is that, from the presentation, I understand that 90% of waste is comes from the negative externalities. And I would like to know how the extended producer responsibility will help to reduce the negative externality and how it help to reduce the waste rate.
Yeah, so that is another regulatory mechanism that puts the burden on the producer. So it's absolutely a very exciting legislative mechanism where it is done properly. So extended producer responsibility basically makes the producer responsible for the entire life cycle of a product. So they don't just wash their hands of it. And ideally, it drives green production, but in practice, it has not, to the satisfaction of most of us that promoted producer responsibility. But ideally, if it's designed properly, it should provide an incentive to not have toxic products to begin with, not have products that are difficult to recycle, not have products with a lot of additives in them that make the recycling impossible, for example. And so it has a force of greening the product upstream and redesigning it. And this, of course, is the answer to so much of the externalities, is to internalize things by not mitigating damage already done, but preventing it from ever causing damage in the first instance. And that's the most progressive way to internalize costs, is to turn off the tap of dirty production. Don't just pay for pollution. That's not the answer. Don't pollute is the answer. Don't create products that are toxic and difficult to recycle. Don't create products that are not circular inherently. And I would argue that plastics is inherently uncircular. And this is why we're realizing, oh my God, plastics have got to stop being produced in the volumes they're produced today. They absolutely have to. The recycling is a fraud. And it's because the actual polymers and their additives together are not inherently recyclable. They're just not. So maybe that'll change someday, but right now, that is not the case. And so this is why we have so much plastic floating around the world right now looking for a home. And unfortunately, all too often that home is in developing countries or it ends up in the marine environment.
Great. We have Yu here. They say, hey, Jim.
Hey, Yu.
What is the connection/correlation between the Basel Ban Amendment with WTO? Which one has the stronger voice to rule?
It's a great question. So this has been raised in academic circles, but nobody has dared to raise it in the actual arena of politics and law. And the reason is that no treaty really can trump the other treaty. They're both global treaties, WTO and the Basel Convention. I believe the Basel Convention actually has more parties than the WTO. The one thing the WTO has is it has a tribunal, so it has an enforcement mechanism built into it. I wish Basel had that, but that doesn't make it inherently more powerful. It can't trump the Basel Convention. And I think the WTO would be loath to play the hand of subverting an international treaty, another treaty, especially one that was developed primarily by developing countries for developing countries. So I think the optics and the politics of challenging the Basel Ban Amendment would be horrific, and they don't want to do that. However, they could. Legally, there are things in the WTO which you could easily say that Basel is discriminatory. It divides the world between Annex 7 and non-Annex 7 countries. All through it, there are things that the WTO thinks is anathema, just a curse. And yet it stands. And it stands that trade barriers are legitimate to protect the environment. WTO has a very weak section about that, but I don't think it's ever going to get challenged in the tribunal, which is what it would have to be. A country would have to complain to the WTO tribunal that the Basel Convention was discriminatory. And I just think that it would be a huge outrage, and a hue and cry would prevent that from ever winning the day.
Great. We have Fenny just giving a thanks for the presentation. Thank you, Fenny, for joining us today. Just as a reminder, because we did have a question about this in our questions, copies of this presentation will be emailed to you afterwards, along with the recorded video. With that said, we have a few more questions here. So I will be unmuting Richard Cook and allow you to ask.
Yeah, a question for Jim. The Basel Convention doesn't have a financial mechanism to support developing countries institutionally and in terms of capacity, unlike its companion conventions, at least in the UN world, Stockholm, Minamata, those kinds of conventions, the Montreal Protocol. What are your thoughts on the convention having that kind of capacity to support developing countries in terms of capacity?
Well, it's a really good idea to do that. Basel didn't have they didn't have it together enough at that time. It's one of the older treaties to make that suggestion, but we've seen how it's been really important at the Stockholm Convention, getting work done on the ground. In lieu of that being, integrated into the treaty text, we have donor countries that, every treaty is funded by donors anyway. But the Basel Convention gets donations largely from countries like Norway, Switzerland, and Japan. And they go into partnership programs where a lot of these projects for doing work on the ground to support the Basel Convention's goals and obligations are funded. And there's been a whole slew of funding that was just released, primarily funded by Norway, to work within the plastic waste partnership, for example, to really do work on the ground to try to prevent plastic pollution. So there are ways to do it, and the Basel Convention has become more and more influential lately, particularly because of e-waste and because of plastic waste. So now it's getting a lot of donor support.
Okay, thank you. Just one comment. A very useful, at least in my own experience, a very useful role the Basel Convention plays is that it's generally the source of the best global guidance on qualify the word best practice, but good practice in terms of the guidelines that it generates. And it does support heavily supports the Stockholm Convention in that regard. So I think something to note to the credit of the Basel Convention is that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So all the different waste streams, we have a lot of technical guidelines now on how to manage those waste streams. They are very useful as a starting place. Remember, though, that they're all negotiated under the concept of consensus and the lowest common denominator. So some of the more progressive requirements for performance on waste streams will be missing, but it's a great starting place. And then you can take the basics and realize, wow, this is the basics and we're not even meeting that. So it's really valuable for countries all over the world.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Along the lines of that, we have a question from Jansen. They asked, is there a relationship between Basel, Rotterdam, and the Stockholm Convention? And how do these conventions complement each other?
Well, there's definitely a relationship, and they were all negotiated separately without really thinking of each other. Then people had the bright idea there's a lot of commonality, and now they're housed together. So those three conventions are all known as the BRS, the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Conventions. They're under the same director, under the same house in Geneva, and they're constantly looking for synergies. Some have more than others. Stockholm and Basel certainly do when it comes to dealing with POPs waste, persistent organic pollutant waste. Rotterdam, they share the concept of prior informed consent. So there's a lot of commonality that's going on. There are a lot of synergies that are being tapped, but not only on the issue area, but on the governance, the process, and the meetings. So nowadays, the meetings pre-COVID all happen back to back in one big meeting. So countries can have the same experts working on the three conventions, and it's much more efficient that way.
Great. With that, we have an interesting question here. Is it possible for a country to leave, i.e., go from being a party to a non-party?
Yes, certainly, but it doesn't happen. I've never known it to happen, but just as you can join a treaty, you can, as a country, pull out, and it's a political decision. And I think there's some verbiage in the convention about how to do that, but it's very simple. So you just make the notification to the depository of the treaty that your country is pulling out. You can make a declaration as to why at that time, if you wish. But I've never known it to happen with any of the multilateral environmental agreements.
Great. Thank you, Anika, for that question. We have a question from Hamantha again. How do the receiving countries identify whether they are going to receive such waste before it arrives to their country? Is there a tracking system?
No. There's a notification that has the information of the expected route it's going to go, what's on board, what's in the container. Usually it's a container. And then I don't even think you have to say the ETA, but you know when it's going to be leaving approximately. And then it's up to the shipping line when it actually arrives at your port. And you could take some extra steps to notify your customs and your agencies at the port to be on watch for something. But ideally, you've already consented to it and you know precisely where it will end up. They have to list the receiving facility, the importer. They have to guarantee that it's environmentally sound management. So the government, if they're diligently enforcing Basel, will have scoped out and made sure that the company that's receiving it is permitted to receive that kind of waste and is capable of processing it in an environmentally sound manner. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen and all the time. And with plastic waste, which has been off the radar of Basel till now, that certainly has not been a requirement that things are done in an environmentally sound manner. It's a lot of loopholes in the law with plastic imports. And so, as I mentioned, so many of them come in mixed polymers, and the workforce has to sit down, often on the ground, use little, flames to detect what type of plastic it is, to separate one polymer from the other, very labor intensive. And then those that are not economically recyclable or are too dirty and contaminated, they go off to a pile. Often that pile is later openly burned. When you openly burn plastic, you create things that are so much more toxic than some of our most toxic wastes. So it's extremely problematic, which is why when the NGO community, many of you, I'm talking, you're the ones that did it, when they exposed what was going on, this was very powerful at the Basel Convention. This is why Norway did what they did and proposed this new controls. And this is why it passed so quickly. Because people had seen the pictures, they knew what was happening. And it all became very apparent once China said, we don't want it anymore. And it became more transparent about what this process really looked like.
Great. We have Olga here. I will be unmuting you, and feel free to ask your question.
Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. I'm sorry, I wanted to write down the question, but I cannot find how to do this. So sorry about that. So I have a question. So how well the environmental sound management of waste is defined under the Basel Convention, and specifically for the plastic waste, is it clear what management approach is allowed and what is not? Should countries provide a confirmation that plastic waste will be managed in an environmentally sound way, and in what way in particular? And very quickly, to another question, it's actually connected to the Rotterdam Convention. So under the Rotterdam Convention, several years ago, the European Union noted that often PIC documents, pre-informed consent documents, are delayed or are not provided by developing countries. And the EU discussed the possibility of putting a certain deadline for providing this kind of PIC. So if this deadline is missed, so the shipment of pesticides would continue anyway. So could it be the case of the plastic waste under the Basel as well? Thank you very much.
Okay, so hope I remember these. So the first question you asked was, how do you define environmentally sound management? And in particular with plastics, what could that mean? The convention defines it really strictly, and you need to hold people to it. It's taking all practicable steps to protect human health and the environment. All practicable steps. That means you got to do the best you can do. So that's the overarching definition. And then they define it further in these guidelines. And those are unfortunately weaker. But I think with the overarching in the text of the convention, the guidelines are just guidelines. They're not binding. The text of the convention is binding. And if you go to a facility and you see that plastics are not being recycled, that a big proportion of them are dumped, obviously that's not taking all practicable steps. And you can absolutely declare that that's not environmentally sound management. The trick is having the scrutiny, having civil society and others actually being able to look at where it's going and to do an assessment and do sampling and take monitoring and check for chemical contamination. This is vital to show that no, you haven't taken all the practicable steps to protect human health and the environment. But they're supposed to pick up these guidelines, and one on plastic waste is being redrafted as we speak. And that's the minimum that they should be doing there. Again, they're just guidelines. They don't say thou shalt. It's just that you should, you should, you should. They're useful, but the real people that are responsible are the governments. The governments that could be stuck in a situation where, wow, this was illegal. Now we're stuck with it. It's contaminated our environment. There's real costs involved. So there is a lot of responsibility placed on the governments to make sure that it's done in a way that's not going to harm the environment and human health. That's the proper way of doing it. Now, the other question you had is where countries are hesitant to fill out the forms and consent after they've received a notification. And there's been a lot of questions as why that is, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people don't want to be held responsible. They know it could come back, and their decision to allow something in could come back to haunt them, because a lot of these facilities, particularly in developing countries, are not environmentally sound. Again, they're used for externalizing costs. So these bureaucrats are sitting there going, really, should I sign off on this? I don't think so. I don't even have the funds to go and really look at that plant, let alone analyze what it's doing. So that's part of the issue. I don't agree that it should ever get to a point, particularly with developing countries, that you just assume consent if you don't hear an answer. That is the wrong approach. But there are real reasons why these forms don't get filled out. It's not just people are lazy or they lost it. Again, so much of what they would be approving should not be approved.
Great. We have a question from Sakib here. They ask, are you seeing any emerging trends around the trade of solar panels, electric car batteries, and other post-consumer waste associated with the green economy?
That's a great question. Lead-acid batteries certainly have been flying around. The lithium-ion batteries, the lead-acid batteries have been with us forever. That's what start our cars, and that's been a problem. I think we have on this call Perry Gottesfield, who's spent his life working on lead pollution, and this has certainly been a big issue, is the trade in lead-acid batteries. But with lithium-ion batteries, this is all new territory, and we all need to do more research on where they're going and whether it's environmentally sound management, because obviously this is a huge part of the green economy. All these electric cars are driven by virtue of lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion batteries are technically hazardous waste. If you just take the very flammable solvents, that would qualify them as hazardous. And then again, they have cobalt in them, which is also can be very problematic. So the chemistry of electronic batteries may change really quickly if somebody makes a breakthrough, but you absolutely have to look at what's happening with batteries. I wish I could tell you they're all going to X, Y, and Z, but I don't know that yet. But we got to stay vigilant. With respect to solar panels, I haven't seen them going across borders. They definitely have some toxicity issues, but most of them that I know about are staying in domestic situations. But maybe somebody knows otherwise, and I'd love to be informed.
Thank you. Speaking about sound management, we have a question here that says, what are the shortcomings of R2 environmental certification compared to E-Stewards?
Yeah, well, we created E-Stewards because R2 ignored the Basel Convention, and they still would like to. They think they covered themselves by saying R2 has to be legal and always, so you can't break the law. But then they do things in the actual certification standard that will violate the Basel Convention. They don't use the same definitions of hazardous waste. They don't respect the Basel Ban Amendment. They're not respecting the new plastics agreements. So they try to cover themselves with a fig leaf of saying, oh, well, we would never allow anything illegal. But the things they ask for are going to lead people to illegality. So if you follow that standard and you don't have the Basel Convention next to you while you're following that standard and you don't really understand it really, really well, then you're making yourself vulnerable to actually being engaged in illegal traffic of waste. And so this is why we created E-Stewards. We wanted it to be completely compliant with the Basel Convention. And we started it primarily because the United States didn't ratify the Basel Convention. And so we had to use market strategies. And one good market strategy, if you do it right, is to have a certification where you identify the good players and then you try to drive the market to them. So it was our strategy to try to identify the E-Stewards recyclers, check them vigilantly, but then get the big companies to agree to use them preferentially. And so we have a whole program called E-Stewards Enterprises, which is companies like Samsung, LG, Bank of America, Bloomberg, Capital One, you name it. These companies have agreed to always use E-Stewards recyclers wherever that's possible. So this is what we're doing to try to drive the market to be compliant with the Basel Convention. We will try to look at ways to do the same with plastic waste as we go forward.
Thank you for that. We have a comment here and a question following after. This person says, countries like the Philippines continue to suffer from waste trade and continue to be a waste dumping ground. They were able to send back some dumped waste, but other waste dumped here are not monitored or acted upon. So that is a comment. However,
well,
I
have a comment on that comment. Philippines needs to ratify the Ban Amendment. Be extremely important. The message it would send is, nope, we're not going to take this stuff anymore. Don't even tempt us. We're going to do what China has done. We're not taking it. And they need to ratify that Ban Amendment.
Great. We have Manny here from the Eco Waste Coalition in the Philippines. They said,
hi, Manny.
Did you say that the protocol on liability and compensation for damage resulting from transboundary movements of waste is not yet enforced? If this is the case, what are the options for receiving countries of illegal waste to get compensated?
Yeah, we had that question before, and your options are very limited. You can try to use the tort law system to have somebody who's been damaged, and we've done this with people damaged in the shipbreaking business, where we'll try to take a shipping line to court because a worker has died trying to recycle their ship. And we have to prove negligence. We have to prove that the shipping line had choices and that there's actually a person that got damaged, and therefore we have standing. Depending on which court you bring it into, you might be able to get that standing agreed to, and then you have a chance. But the whole exercise is very valuable, even if you lose the case. Usually they get settled, but the more publicity behind the case, the better for the entire issue. But yeah, you have very limited choices to actually get compensated for damage done with waste trade, which is why it's extremely important to make sure that the exporters are prosecuted of any kind of violation. And this is what some countries have been reluctant to do. Canada is a perfect example with respect to the Philippines. They refused to really prosecute the exporter, then they refused to take it back as a country for years. It took a decade. And we were able to prove that they had violated the Basel Convention. Canada admitted it to me that they hadn't properly implemented the convention in their own laws. But that's not an excuse in international law, by the way. If you don't properly implement it in your national laws, you're still bound by the treaty. So the treaty is de facto part of national law. And Canada refused to recognize that for the longest time.
Great. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, but we have Prigi from Ikotan in Indonesia. They say, in Indonesia, we face a microplastic problem that disposal by paper mill using imported plastic and paper waste from developed countries. They're asking what's the mechanism to ask a developed country for being responsible?
Yeah, so I think what he's talking about there is Indonesia gets a lot of plastic waste coming in via paper recyclers. So these bales are very impure. They're mixed paper and plastics, And just washing the material, as they do in pulp mills, will put microplastics into the environment. And this is something that could and should be captured under the new plastic rules, because it's contaminated plastic stream. And even though they're saying they're bringing it in as paper, in fact, it's a contaminated plastic stream, and therefore it has to be controlled. Therefore, you have to prove environmentally sound management, and that means you have to take all practicable steps to manage things like microplastics. So you have, and also the actual trade had to be approved at both the exporting state and the importing state. So it gives us some legal hooks to go after them. But yeah, plastic is just horrific. Paper recycling by itself can be really problematic with eutrophication and such of waters. But plastics is very problematic. A lot of people don't know, but plastics not only break down into microplastics, but almost every polymer, I think every polymer, someone has said, in a plastics use has additives. And many times these additives are toxic. And many times they're even more toxic if they're burned. So you're bringing in forms of toxicity by virtue of saying, don't worry, we're going to recycle it, it's all good. And this is why I say that plastics, unfortunately, are inherently not circular. They cannot be used and marketed without these additives. The additives give them the colors, they give them their flexibility, they give them their special nature, and they don't make good products, polymers, by themselves. So it's always a polymer plus a series of additives, which can cause tremendous problems, toxicity being just one of them.
Great. And one of those, if I may add a comment to that, one of those things are BFRs, so brominated flame retardants within plastics, I believe.
Yeah.
That is very toxic. We have a few remaining questions here. Hold on a second. Are there any suggestions for ways citizens can put pressure on the U.S. government to ratify?
Yeah. We got a new administration, and there's new interest because of plastics. And we're in a new situation in the US where people are going, oh my God, these countries that we've been sending all our plastic waste to, like Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, we've been sending it there and we have nowhere else to send it. And right now, the law is such that those countries are not allowed to accept these plastic waste from the United States anymore. So we have a weird situation where the US actors, the exporters, can go ahead and export it legally. They won't get prosecuted in the US. But the big problem is all of these wastes, if we're vigilant as civil society, are going to be seized. Make sure our governments follow the convention. They're going to be seized and repatriated back to the US. So we're going to have all this material that used to flow to China and then move to Southeast Asia is going to be coming back to the US. This is very problematic. All of these states and cities have programs that are based on maximizing recycling. And they've been getting away with the idea that, don't worry, it's going to be recycled in Asia. It's a great thing. Unfortunately, it's not only not a great thing, but now it's illegal. So they're really stuck. And right now I've been talking to Californians, for example, and they're going, oh my God, we're going to have all this bad publicity of all this waste coming back to California. We don't know what to do with it. It's going to have to go to landfills or incinerators. And so much of this incoherence is the fact that US is not part of the treaty. So I do think that on the whole, it's a good thing now that the US joined the Basel Convention. It was questionable before because they refused to accept the Ban Amendment. But now I think by being part of it, it's going to be net positive, and they're going to have to be much more cognizant of the rules of the road for trade and environmentally sound management of recycling, etc. So all this pressure from the states and cities of what to do when their exports are declared illegal, hopefully we'll have enough impetus, along with all the other reforms on plastic, single-use plastics bans, etc., that it'll be part of a package that we will finally bite the bullet and ratify the convention. You know, Biden, one of the first things he did was get back into the Paris Accords. Well, we've never even been in the Basel Convention. And, you know, it's glaring. I told you, we're the only developed country and the most wasteful country in the world that's not part of the treaty. And Biden, I think, if he has the opportunity, and his administration, moreover, has the opportunity to look at that, they'll put it on the map. I do think it'll have to get consent all over again. It got consent from the Senate earlier in the Papa Bush days, but now it's a fundamentally different treaty because the Ban Amendment is in there. So it probably will have to get consent in the Senate again. But I think there's a lot of impetus, and I don't want to hold my breath, but it's a new day. We feel that in the U.S., and anything's possible.
Great. We just have a few questions remaining. One of those questions is there a sanction by the Basel Convention to parties or country members that not enforce Basel, that do not enforce the Basel Ban Amendment?
No. Again, international law requires its enforcement is all about national goodwill to enforce what you've signed on to and to live by it. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work. And so again, you have those three options. You can shame them, you can take them to court in some instances, you can go to the compliance committee. Those are the only three options that I know about. Basel doesn't have a tribunal like the WTO where you can take a complaint there. But shaming countries does work. Sometimes it takes a while, but absolutely, most countries take their international responsibilities to heart and will move if you pressure them enough.
Great. I think that answers a few questions. We do have a question asking if there have been any cases of reparations of waste from South Asia or repatriation.
Repatriation?
Of waste from South Asia.
That was repatriated?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. Years ago, when I first started working on this issue, I remember some fertilizer, so-called micronutrients containing contaminants from the metals industry in the U.S. was exported to Bangladesh, and it had to get sent back, which was recoverable. That was the first instance I remember of that happening in South Asia. There's been some recent repatriations of plastic waste from Sri Lanka. And imagine we could come up with a pretty good list, but I would say there's probably been a dozen incidences that we could probably find.
Great. Hiroaki says, thank you so much for the presentation, Jim. Can we expect a dramatic drop in the plastic waste trade because of the new regulation?
Yeah, it's anybody's guess. My guess is that they're going to do everything they can to keep the export going for a while. So what that'll mean is it'll go underground a bit. There are going to be much more mischaracterizations on shipping documents. There's going to be money paid to certain small governments, including city governments, to accept waste. And they're going to try to keep it undercover, because if they don't export, there aren't a lot of avenues for them. and a lot of them are much more expensive. And they also put the lie to the industry that everything's recyclable, so don't worry. So if you start ending up having to landfill, if cities start having to landfill all of their plastic waste that they promised their citizens would be recycled, this is not good for the industry. The industry writ large is the most powerful industry in the world. It's the fossil fuel industry. And they're trying very hard to double down on saying, don't worry, we just got to get better at recycling. And the places they've been able to get away with that are in developing countries, because nobody goes to look and really see what the recycling looks like. I've had conversations with the US government, and they said, well, how can you be against recycling, Jim? And I said, well, let me ask you this. How do you support something that you've never looked at? Have you ever been to these facilities? And they say, not yet. But they don't get in their airplanes and go, even pre-COVID, to see what they're promoting really looks like. So everybody's hiding behind the word recycling. But like any industrial activity, it can be a disaster. Recycling can be just as dirty as any other industry. And they've been ironically using that word, which was invented by our movement, to cloak their dirty deeds. And we have to call it out. But I think in the first instance, to answer your question, they're going to keep finding new countries to go to. It's a big world out there, and that's how they see it.
That question and comment. Pamela here asks, do you support not recycling plastics since they are not really being recycled?
Yeah, you cannot pretend anymore. There's very few good examples of plastics recycling. Those that are good examples, we should analyze them as to why they are. And so I think the future is going to hold that we make a lot less plastics. The ones we do make have to be in durable use, so they are continued use for a long time. And they have to be designed so that when they reach the end of life of that use, they can be safely recycled. And that use, of course, needs to be necessary. You don't make swizzle sticks just because that's all you think you can do with plastic and it's very cheap. You have to have products that are really sensible, and they have to be designed for the full life cycle. But we're a long way away from there. We have way too many polymers, way too many additives, and we'd have no means of collecting it all. It has very little value, so inherently you cannot expect it to be collected. It's not made out of gold. It's the opposite. It's really very valueless. So how can you mandate people to recycle something that's not valuable? It's very difficult. So for a lot of issues and reasons, we can say that the recycling of plastic is fraudulent, and we have to really do our best to get back to an age where we didn't use so much plastic.
Great. Sergey out there said in comment to, I think, the South Asia repatriation, that Laos is one of them. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
We have 3 last questions here. Carter has an incredible question here and comment. They say, any thoughts on the study that came out last December that found that plastics are now found in placentas? I feel that this should have generated a lot more outrage. What will it take to wake up Americans?
It's a really depressing question. I also was amazed, and the more we read about microplastics, they're in all of us. We don't know yet the full impact. And even industries that we thought were benign, like the company Patagonia has very much wanted to be a player in doing green things and good things for the planet. Their whole business model was to recycle plastics and make fleece. And now we learn that those fleeces are making microplastics, contaminating our planet. So I think we're going to have to really publicize this at every chance we get. We got to shine a spotlight on not only the dumping in Asia and Africa or wherever it is, but also the dumping we don't really see, which is microplastics. And that these things may be qualifying as hazardous waste, not just as the Basel Convention has done other waste, that they actually should be forbidden from trade as a first step, but that moreover to be forbidden to be produced. We can go back to a time before fleece where we didn't make our clothes out of plastic. If you want to do something funny, which I did the other day, you look at an old video of how airplanes used to run. And you know, when you get on an airplane now, you're just like horrified by how much waste one person produces. Multiply that by all the passengers, multiply that by all the airplanes, and all the plastic that comes off of a plane at the end of a flight. Well, look at the old videos from the early 60s and 50s, and you will see them serving everybody with silverware, with china, with tongs, with cloth napkins, and it was very elegant. It's a different way of looking at the world. And we've got to do that. We've got to realize, wow, we weren't doing everything wrong back in the 50s and 60s with respect to materials use. So got to take a look at everything we're doing, but I think there's too many people that have bought the lie that the fossil fuel industry paid for, which is that, don't worry, it's going to be recycled, and recycling is always good. And this is just a complete fraud when it comes to plastics.
All right, we have two last questions. One here by Luke. I will be unmuting you. Unmute yourself there, Luke, and you'll be able to ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much.
You might need to mute your sound or ask the question through the chat, but let me unmute you one more time.
Give him a try.
Okay, thank you. Let me try one more time. Okay, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I did learn quite a lot of things from it, and I really hope to be following the upcoming webinars so that I can really gain more from this subject. I wanted to ask that apart from the efforts that a party country can do in the face of a violation, say for example, there is an illegal import of plastic waste, and the party country is faced with such a situation. Apart from what you have indicated that the country can try to do in order to prevent that illegal import, what else can be done from the side of the Basel Action Network, or from the side of the convention structures itself? For example, if we consider what happens with the Rotterdam Convention, if there are decisions that are made by party countries, the Secretariat makes effort to post such decisions on the website. So I wanted to ask if such violations, for example, can be posted on the ban website, so that number one, it can serve as a way of shaming the violators, and then secondly, it can also assist the other party countries to see what has happened in the past, for reference in the future when dealing with such countries. Is there such a kind of thing happening with either the Basel Convention or specifically the Basel Action Network?
No, I understand it's part of the shaming category, and it's very important. So there was a time when we regularly published notifications of non-compliance from the Basel Action Network, an NGO, because there was so little activity on e-waste for illegal traffic. And so we would put those out and give them to all the delegates. And we're going to start doing that again with the plastic waste. now that we've got some new legal hooks there that we can actually show that things are illegal, we're going to have this hub, the transparency hub I mentioned on the website, where you can go in, click on a country, and even if you don't click on a country and see all its incidents and its illegality if it's there, we can have a section that just has all these non-compliance notifications. So that is a powerful force because nobody likes to be called the bad guy. And it's a form of report card. And as I mentioned, it's very powerful. It doesn't always work immediately, but you put people on notice that they have violated. And it is something that I think is worthy of resurrecting. We used to do it regularly with e-waste, and I think we need to do it now as plastic waste gets more and more crazy.
Thank you for that, Luke. We have one last question here, and I'll add a little bit to this question. So Jane here asks, how can NGOs like those in Australia collaborate with other OECD and AP NGOs to pressure our countries to ratify the Ban Amendment?
Wow. Hi, Jane. Yeah, it's just the Just Cans countries have been in lockstep for so long on the wrong side of these environmental justice issues. But I do see cracks, and one of them was the plastic agreement, where we had Japan agreeing, we had Australia agreeing, Canada agreeing, when before they were all in lockstep with the US, that they wouldn't agree such things that actually have teeth and actually control things and sometimes forbid activities. So it's starting to get interesting that the world geography and all the little cliques we have that operate in these treaties may be dissolving. We've had all this noise from the Australian Prime Minister that he wants to ban waste trade. We hear the same thing in the UK. We hear some noise in Canada. And it all comes down to, yeah, but what are you really wanting to still export? And why are you going to exempt that? So we're always a little cautious to embrace these big statements. But the reason these politicians are making these big statements is they know it's popular. It's very popular not to dump on your global neighbors. This is seen as a bad thing. And so that's what that's our means to really get things done, is that these things, doing the right thing is very popular with respect to this issue. Nobody's going to have to pay out of their pockets to clean up the act of Australia. It's seen as just, the golden rule. You don't do this to poorer countries. You don't do it to anybody. You don't dump your toxic waste on them. You don't dump your plastic waste on them. You don't dump your garbage over your back fence. So it's very easy to explain. And I think we're all doing our best to try to push this. But I think what you might be getting at is some kind of a final campaign push where we have a major push in all these Just Cans countries to just get it done. If we had one country to break from the others and start it, it would be brilliant. I don't know which that country is right off the bat. I don't think it's going to be the US, but who knows?
Great. With that said, as I've stated, this webinar will be available to you online, as well as via a link into your email, as well as the PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. I hope it was worthwhile. I guess when we do part 2, I'll know if it was worthwhile, but we hope to get one out about every month and a half or so. And so I haven't got the regular schedule, but we'll be doing another one of these and another one of these. And there's a lot to be told and a lot to have a dialogue about. So stay with it. And I appreciate you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.